she'll take some time at the end to take questions from you all. So while the presentation's going on, if you have kind of questions, kind of write them down and make sure you're ready for the Q&A session. And usually we alternate sites, but if there's only one, we can just spend all the time with the questions at your site. And you can also encourage anyone to watch online. We have a link on our website, and you can also submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag SAIwebinar, and also join our Facebook event if you want to post questions that way. So please, this is meant to be interactive, so please, ask a lot of good questions. And I think we're going up for about an hour and a half is when the Q&A is ending. So I'll let Malavika take over.
Hi, everyone. We've given this talk the very grand title of Who Owns Big Data, but I think within that title you have so many different subtitles that this talk could have been titled. Is ownership even the right scheme to look at data? Should anyone own big data? Is it even possible to own big data? So it actually, when you start looking at the question of big data, you end up unpacking a lot of related and completely unrelated issues. So we're just going to talk through some of them. And just as a bit of a clarification and a disclaimer, knowing that the primary audience for this is people in Pakistan, I've geared it very much towards a developing world perspective. So for people who might be dialing in from elsewhere, who have a very Western idea of what big data and ownership implies, I would request your patience while we cover some issues that are of more relevance and salience to people in emerging economies. So I wanted to start off with a slide that to me represents something that might be a little counterintuitive, but it's a slide from a wonderful collection of photographs by a photographer called Jan Banning. The series is called Bureaucratics, and she tried to visualize what bureaucracy looks like in different countries. And this was one of the entries from India. And most people would look at this and think, it's some form of bureaucracy. It represents all the evils of badly governed countries, or, what a fire hazard this is, or what happens when this poor guy is not on duty and you need to get some documents. And the filing system is something that only exists in his head. And if he's, off for Eid or Diwali, then good luck trying to get hold of him. But for me, this represents something which is really interesting, which is that this is also a form of big data. So when we think of big data in a Western context, we think of something like this. If you were to look for big data on Google, if you did an image search, these are the kinds of images you would get. Something very clinical, very computer sciencey, very science fiction. And it represents something that's very clean, antiseptic, sterile, something that signals technology. But what's really curious is that unlike this picture, which I think of as big data because I grew up in India, to me this encapsulates a lot of the wonderful and horrible things about big data. I like this image more because there's actually a human being in this. When you look at this conception of big data, it's infrastructure, it's architecture, it's ones, it's zeros, it's something very removed from the lived experience, something very distant from human life. So for me, something like this is more representative of the kind of big data that you see in a lot of emerging economies, where data is collected, data is correlated, data is stored, and it forms a very rich picture of the people that it relates to. But it could be stored in a completely idiosyncratic filing system. It could be stored in somebody's head, and it could be the embodiment of somebody's memory. It could be something that's very personal to that person's view of the world, to the way that he sees structure and the way that he sees rhythms and patterns. Nobody else might make sense of that. But when you look at this, it sort of implies that it's so techno philic and it's so advanced that it's something that anybody could touch and use. There's something very universal about this kind of language and this kind of visual of it. So I just wanted to start off with that sort of view of how different big data can look depending on where you're from. The other thing I wanted to mention was we keep hearing about different metaphors about data. And a colleague of mine at the Berkman Center wrote this wonderful article called Data is the New Blank, whatever you want it to be. And she talks about the industrial metaphors of big data. And, she clubs them into different categories. She talks about how, you have a lot of natural metaphors from the natural world about data is a deluge, data is a tsunami, data is an avalanche, data is oil. All of which seem to imply that there's something very natural about this, but at the same time implying implicitly within it that there's something uncontrollable about it, that there's something that human beings can't quite manage, and that it doesn't stay within its boundaries, and it doesn't behave the way that it's expected to. And I've provided a link to the article later in the slides, but I would urge you to read this because it's a really wonderful meditation on how the way that we view data as the new oil, the new currency, the new all kinds of things, is a really, really critical look at what data means to society and how technology and society actually interact in the way that we parse and make meaning out of data. And why is this even relevant? Why do we care about the language that we use? Why do we care about metaphors? Why do we care about how we describe data or big data? Lakoff and Johnson very famously said that framing is important because the people who get to impose their metaphors on a culture get to define what we consider to be true. And we know this from media studies, we know this from sociology, that the way that you describe a phenomenon helps actually create and frame that phenomenon. In the course of description, you're actually creating and redefining and imposing a view. And the people who get to pick language and the people who get to pick metaphors and help to guide the public discourse often get to define what is considered to be real, authentic, and true in a civilization. So the metaphors that we use, the frames that we use to talk about data are really, really critical and important for this reason. I wanted to then talk about some of the common themes that you see in the ICT world, in the Internet and Communication Technologies world, but more specifically in the ways that ICT is used for development. These are some of the themes that I come across, and this is a very personal take from my research and my work as a lawyer, as an academic, and as a researcher, and as someone who's been very close to civil society and policy making. These are some of the themes that keep coming up, and they're cliches in a way, and of course, like all cliches, they're partly true, but also partly stereotypical and not necessarily true of every situation, but there's something about generalities that holds something deeper. And these are some of the themes that I keep coming across over and over again. One is this belief, almost a blind faith, that technology is neutral. We're beginning to understand in the West that this is not necessarily true, but it's something that's quite new in the developing world. The idea that in countries where corruption is so endemic, in countries where people are seen as easy to bribe and eminently corruptible, where we see that systems fail us, where governments fail us, where they don't necessarily represent the wishes of the common person, somehow there's this belief that technology is neutral, objective, and somehow performs some kind of a truth-telling function. People don't trust other people, but they trust a machine. They think, well, if the machine says so, it must be true. And for people who are uneducated, for people who are not digitally literate, this is even more so. There's this blind faith that the machine must represent some higher truth. And if not just the machine, it's also the data that is contained in the machine and the data that it displays, collects, and stores. So there is this idea that at a fundamental level, data embodies some kind of truth, that it performs some kind of truth-telling function. And when you think of it, scale plays a huge role in this. The bigger the data, the better it is. If you have more data, you have a richer picture, you can tell better stories. And there's also this view that the more access you have, the more technology you create that enables access, the better the conditions of access, somehow you've magically created equality. that just by giving people internet access or access to a tool or access to a technology, you've somehow made that democratic. And when it's digital, there's a sense that it's even more democratic. There may be many ways in which these things are not true, but these are so common in my work that I wanted to just highlight them as they're almost self-evident, and they almost underpin the way that policy handles these things. Policymakers who may not necessarily be technology experts or specialists on any level, they keep moving from doing environmental policy one day to doing cybersecurity the next day to doing forests and rivers the next day. They're not specialists in all of these things. But if they ask the right questions, and if they actually approach it with some level of critical thinking, unpacking these themes would be very, very useful in creating really truly democratic and equality-enhancing products and systems. And what do all of these things add up to? This belief that technology is the answer. But I think for me, what I would urge you all to remember is, what was the question? What was the question that technology was supposed to be the answer to? And often you find that money gets spent on the tool, money gets spent on building a new website, money gets spent on the platform. And sometimes that is exactly the right answer, sometimes that is the way to go. And sometimes technology can provide scale, and it can provide reach, and it can provide all kinds of things that doing it in an offline mode might not do. But this isn't something that we should just believe to be evident and true before we unpack it. It's something that we need to question and interrogate, not just at the beginning of a project or when you start to roll out a new system, but it's something you need to keep engaging with throughout rolling out that technology, to keep saying, is it still the answer to the problem we're trying to solve? And if we've solved part of the problem, do we want to reframe the technology or shape it slightly differently so that we're now answering new, deeper, and richer questions? So what are some of the concerns that come out of big data as a phenomenon? One is this belief that by making everyone visible, you're making them legible to a government. That by providing enhanced visibility of people, by putting them in a database, by having those databases talk to other databases, that somehow you're making people more visible to companies, to governments, to whatever systems are behind them. But one of the concerns or the flip sides of this is, in doing so, or if you do it without the right parameters in place, are you actually making those people more vulnerable? So to give you some concrete examples, if you were to provide a list of all the people who work on human rights defense in a country like Pakistan, all the people lobbying to get YouTube to be shown, or all the people lobbying for certain kinds of hate speech to be outlawed, or for them to be managed better on social media, maybe the government would have an interest. In a country like India, if you said certain unpopular things on social media, maybe being visible and not being anonymous actually puts you at risk. When you collect all of these pieces of information that people may have said, without really thinking, tweeting something from their mobile phone in the middle of the night, without really thinking about the implications of something living on the internet. When you add up all these pieces of small data that in and of themselves seem really innocuous, or if you think, well, I'm in a tax database and I'm in a driver's license database, or, I get a ration card to get benefits for rice or cooking oil. All of these things seem completely innocent. But when all of these things are combined and when they're trawled and scraped in ways that provide very rich information for the people in control of these systems, not necessarily for the user, are you somehow making these people more vulnerable the more knowledge about them is available? What about things like inclusion? In trying to roll out financial inclusion through a lot of e-governance systems and to create credit rating systems, are we actually providing some kind of social exclusion? Are people being left out in this drive? Similarly, if there is a digital divide, and if some people have more access to technology and systems and infrastructure than other people, are you creating some kind of a privacy divide? And also in terms of exclusion, does it mean that people who don't have as much access to technology are suddenly kicked out of systems that they used to be able to access when it was offline, when they could go talk to a human being, that then they could participate in a form of governance and they could exercise their citizenship rights? when everything goes digital and online, are they able to exercise their preferences? Are they able to make their views known in quite the same way? And do they understand the ways in which data is being used about them? What about things like bias? We have this idea that technology may be neutral, or that machines don't in themselves have any kind of bias. But behind all of these things is a human being who is writing the software, who is creating these systems, who is picking certain design choices over others. And there are certain algorithms that have a life of their own, and software writes other software. Is there some kind of encoded judgment or preference that is being played out through this? Most people who use technology might not know what that is, which is why transparency is so huge when you're dealing with things like big data. What about asymmetries? Ultimately, one of the key questions about anything involving technology is a question of power. And when you have an information asymmetry, or when you have a technology asymmetry, and when you have haves and have-nots, you also have power divides and imbalances. And does this lead to some kind of social sorting? Are you making decisions about groups of people just because they belong to certain categories? Because you've made decisions about, oh, they did A, B, and C kinds of things. They exhibited these kinds of behavior. They shopped at these kind of stores. Their browsing habits reveal certain things. Do those kinds of pieces of information enable companies and governments to discriminate against certain people and to offer preferences to certain other people? And when the user doesn't know that this is being done, does it actually disadvantage them? So the sum total of all of the concerns on this slide, do they add up to some kind of disparate impact? Does it mean that in trying to provide equality, we're somehow actually treating people very, very differently in a way that we would not were all these systems not handling and storing so much data, which at the time of each transaction or each interaction, each experience online, we didn't really have a sense of what kind of big picture they were building, how they were contributing to this idea of big data, and how they were somehow being crunched and scraped and investigated and analyzed in ways that we never anticipated when we were providing and generating these pieces of data. What are the other kinds of concerns? When these kinds of decisions are being made through big data systems, what does that happen to choice and the ability for an individual to determine their future, or to determine how they would like to be treated or how they would like to behave? One of the problems with big data that people have pointed out is that it often functions by extrapolation. It believes that because you did 1, 2, and 3 things, you will act in a particular manner for step 4. But that's not necessarily true. Just because somebody behaved a certain way once or twice or even 3 times, it doesn't guarantee that they will behave that way again. But big data often believes in some notion of prediction. It takes a few pieces of data and says, well, you did all of these things, so you may do this next time. And based on that potential, or based on that eventuality, it makes certain decisions. So for example, certain pieces of behavior in financial terms may have a very big bearing on whether you get a loan, whether you get a mortgage. It could be something really small that you did. You maybe repaid something 1 day late. You had no idea that 5 years down the line it would impact your ability to get a mortgage. You had no idea that it would affect your interest rate. And you're not even sure when your loan is denied by a bank why it's been denied. They just say the system says you don't qualify, or the system has rejected your application. And you're not quite told in each instance, there were these 17 pieces of data about you, and 4 of them were in favor of giving you this loan, and 13 of them were against you. And you have no ability to go back and actually change and correct those things. One of the things that a credit rating system will do is, when done well, it could actually provide you that information. You can at any point query your credit score and have a little more granularity about that, how that works. But in a lot of emerging economies, you don't have a credit scoring system. So to some extent, big data might contribute towards that, and a lot of e-governance schemes and financial inclusion projects might actually enable a better system of information sharing for credit scoring. But I just wanted to highlight that if it's not implemented well, or if it's done in a very hasty manner without thinking about these kinds of ethical issues, it might actually foreclose certain options for people. Instead of having a huge spectrum of choice they may have just one or two. And it may mean that, yes, you can get a loan, but at this very high rate. Or, yes, you can get an insurance policy, a medical insurance policy, but because we've seen all this information that we've collected from so many different hospitals, because we have no confidentiality or we don't have any privacy laws in place, we can actually use all of that information to say, okay, we'll give you an insurance policy, but the premium will be really, really high. So those are the kinds of ways in which it might predict or foreclose choices that would otherwise be available to you if so much data wasn't being collected and shared. I've already talked about inclusion and exclusion at a general level. One of the other key things is this wonderful idea that a privacy and computer science and philosophy academic, Professor Helen Nissenbaum, coined. She came up with this idea called contextual integrity, where she talks about, if I will explain this very briefly, but she talks about how if you think of a particular transaction or a particular context in which you may think, I'm perfectly happy to hand over this data, I'm perfectly happy to share this information about myself, because the benefit that I'm going to get is something I consider so valuable and worthwhile that I don't mind if somebody has my data. So that could be something as simple as you're willing to use Gmail or Facebook, even though they collect a lot of information, because you think, well, I'm not paying for it, it's free. And in exchange for it being free, I'm happy for the company to, use my information and advertise to me or sell it in some way. I don't mind if they monetize it, either financially or in terms of information, because I get a benefit that I consider worthwhile. So when people make that kind of a bargain or a trade-off, then there is this assumption that that is limited to just that transaction or that context. So what Helen talks about is how within that context, that trade-off might make sense. But the second that information starts to leak into a different context and where it transcends a particular boundary that would be considered appropriate or proportionate for that transaction or that experience, that's when we need to worry. So there might be a breach, either of trust or some kind of a data breach or some kind of a privacy violation when data starts to cross these kinds of borders. Those borders may not always be very clear, and it may need a lot of careful thought to figure out where the contours of these kinds of protections in these contexts lie. But I find contextual integrity a very, very useful frame to think about what might be appropriate and what might not be. So if I disclose data to a company in the context of applying for a loan, I would expect that to be only used for deciding whether to grant me a loan or not. I would not expect that to be used for all kinds of other information sharing, or to sell it to somebody, or to share it with my government and to surveil me and to put me under suspicion. So this idea of contextual integrity is a really useful framework to think about how when data crosses invisible boundaries or even visible ones, we might be in the presence of something a little uncomfortable or maybe even illegal. The other concern is about a creeping kind of surveillance society where each piece of data that you disclose may not be under surveillance by a government, but as more and more data is shared, it's very tempting both for companies and for governments to want to watch what people are doing all of the time. And this goes against something very fundamental, that people should really only be under watch or under surveillance when they've done something wrong, when there is suspicion that they've committed a crime. This idea that you surveil populations and you surveil entire categories of people who have done nothing wrong, that kind of a view is something that might create a police state, and where as it happens more and more and people get more used to it, they don't know how to protest against it, or they don't quite know how to actually fight against this, because they think, well, A, I can't do anything about it, B, everyone is doing it, and C, I don't even know who is collecting this information and who they're sharing it with. So even if I wanted to take action, who would I even take action against? So when data that was previously kept pretty contained within one database or within one kind of a silo, if you think of it as one sort of self-contained space or a building, when that starts getting linked with other pieces of data and other databases, you might create a system where a government or a company has total information about that person, And that may create all kinds of risks, not just from a privacy perspective, but it may expose people to all kinds of other harms. It might mean that when people know that they're under watch all the time, they may watch what they say. They may feel that if they're not anonymous or they're not private or their conversations are not protected, they will be terrified of saying something that they believe to be unpopular, which means that the marketplace of ideas that is so integral to a democracy, the idea that we should be free to listen not just to views that we agree with, but to things that we don't agree with, precisely because they help educate us, they help us understand the society that we live in, they help us understand where the other side is coming from, and it performs a very useful bridging function. If we don't know how other people think, we're unable to have empathy towards their points of view, we're unable to understand where they're coming from. So it could have a really severe chilling effect on people's freedom of speech, on freedom of association. They may not want to form groups on Facebook to discuss very critical issues. People may not want to discuss religious concerns or health concerns. They may not want to discuss very embarrassing things in particularly repressive societies about their gender, about their sexuality, that they feel, if they're under watch, would be problematic for them. Also, this idea that a lot of people who collect data and think that, oh, well, it's fine, people want this, and they're happy to make that trade-off, they sort of skim over the fact that a lot of these trade-offs are very complex. They're trade-offs that are not always made in one self-contained universe. They're not always made at the same time. They're not always made with the same company. And they're not zero-sum games. It's not a question of, well, you can have privacy or you can have a benefit, or you can have transparency or you can have security. Often these things are a lot more nuanced than that. And when we look at data as something that can either provide one function or the other, we do both data and all of these functions a disservice. So to recognize in all of these, when we're architecting these systems, that these kinds of trade-offs that we expect people to make are actually very subtle, nuanced ones. They're not things that, are just made in the moment and that they just are stable things. They're dynamic choices that keep changing as products change. We know the kind of grief that companies like Facebook get into every single time they change their privacy policy or their terms of use. And most people have better things to do than to keep updating their knowledge of privacy policies. So to keep in mind that these are very, very complex equations and bargains that people strike, and they're not necessarily aware that they're even striking them at the time that they make them. One of the other questions to engage with is, often when we roll out systems that collect and harness and use a lot of data with a view to solve a particular problem, is it a very technical solution to a problem that actually has social, political, and economic ramifications? Are we only looking at how we solve the technology end of the puzzle and how we just fix that particular piece, how we deliver it better, how we deliver it faster, how we put it online, how we deliver it at scale, without actually thinking about the more difficult issues behind the problem? Often problems are not just single issue things. They're not just about the technology not working well enough. They're often about the society in which that technology is deployed, the cost of accessing that technology, and that cost could be financial, it could be non-financial. It's about the political implications. It's about alternatives. It's about what rolling out those things could have by way of side effects or unintended consequences, and actually running pilot projects to check how data plays out in this landscape and what the local context of these things are. Something that works in Germany, which might have particular data protection guidelines and where people might all have a particular level of information awareness, that kind of a product might work really well in Germany and fail spectacularly in Southeast Asia. So to always be mindful of local context, local knowledge, and this is often, it's said so often in conferences that I feel it shouldn't be necessary anymore, but the fact that we still keep repeating it shows how it's a problem that still needs to be solved. People keep saying, put the user back into the equation or put the human being back into the picture. And the fact that we need to keep repeating this in 2015 means that this is something we're actually doing very, very badly. We're failing at. We often think of technology as being the solution. The platform will solve all of the problems, without thinking that no, there are actually real people and real choices and real life experiences underlying all of these systems. When these systems are rolled out without any kind of feedback loop, without engaging with the community that that it's supposed to help, without actually talking to them saying, does the interface work for you? Is it too complicated? Is this even what you want? Does it actually help you with predicting the weather or the crops for your particular farm? Does it actually give you real-time information? Is it displayed in a way that people who are not very literate can understand? Does it have enough visual information? Does it work on low bandwidth phones? Does it work when the internet is down? Can you save these things offline? So if you don't actually engage with the user and you don't provide feedback loops on a lot of these systems, the promises of big data may be lost. And I might currently be focusing on a lot of the concerns, but that's because all the benefits of big data are so well documented and charted. People always feel that big data is going to solve so many things that previous generations were not able to, that just by having more data at our fingertips, we can solve health problems, we can look at trends, we can look at how disease surveillance happens. And Dr. Sachit Balsari will talk about this in the next webinar that we'll have in November, where he talks about how during the very, very big festival in India, the Kumbh Mela, they used a lot of techniques to actually map how diseases could spread and how epidemics could take off. So there are very, very real problems that big data can solve, or that it helps towards resolving. But in order for us to harness those benefits without losing out on it because of all the risks, I'm just focusing a little more on the concerns right now, because I feel those are not very well understood in a lot of Asia, where governments are so keen to be up to speed on technology and so keen to roll out the next big thing, and to use it as some kind of a catch-up to compensate for various stages of development that they feel they're behind on. Big data is seen as one of the ways that they can tackle these problems. So I'm urging that a little bit of nuance and a little bit of thoughtfulness and consciousness, both of the user, the context, and the unintended or intended consequences or side effects, is a really, really useful way to approach these things. One of the other concerns is, as more and more data is collected, the authenticity, the provenance, and the source of these pieces of information becomes increasingly blurred. You're not quite sure what is real data, what is junk data, what is, you make an error in a system. Nobody bothers to correct it because they didn't know the spelling is wrong or the date of birth is wrong. In something that uses very large quantities of data, when we're talking big data, those kinds of errors can get duplicated and replicated across every single system that the data gets shared with, but nobody knows that it's an error. So towards combating these kinds of identity theft or other kinds of fraud that people might roll out to take advantage of these kinds of mistakes and errors, there's an increasing move towards solutions like biometrics, where you say, well, okay, the pieces of information may be wrong, but there is something very stable about the human body. We'll use your fingerprint to make sure that it's really you, to authenticate a transaction, because there's so much data in the system that we don't quite know that it relates to the real person. So let's make sure that it's the correct person we're dealing with to validate a transaction. Banking systems do this, and all kinds of other systems increasingly do it. Passports, visas, border controls increasingly rely on this idea of the body as being the best password you can possibly have, for several reasons. One, because unlike numbers and phrases that are difficult to remember, and of course security experts will always tell you, don't write it down, don't put it on a post-it and stick it on your computer so somebody else could find it, and that poses a security risk. So you don't have to remember if it's biometrics. You always have your irises, you always have your fingerprints, your voice is always present, to do voice analysis when you call in to do online banking or voice activated banking. So there is this belief that the body is stable, but a lot of research is showing that it's not as stable as we think, and that it's not as infallible and error proof as we think, that fingerprints can often fail. The error rates are very high, and the error rates are even higher in the developing world because so many people do manual labor. So many people are farmers. So many people do very hard labor where their fingerprints get worn off. So then they say, okay, well, the fingerprints may not be great, so we'll use the iris. But with each sort of identifier added, while you might be increasing the lack of errors in your system, you're also putting very, very, very sensitive, very personal information at risk. And as we've been seeing recently with so many systems being hacked, even by very, very well-known huge companies that should know better, and as this becomes a sort of arms race for hackers and governments ultimately, all of this really sensitive information being online and being made available without the right security infrastructure in place can actually pose really serious risks to people and make them vulnerable. Because if you lose a password, you can change it. Somebody can send you a reminder. You may be able to answer a few security questions. What was your mother's maiden name? But even those pieces of information are so easy to find now on social media. So we involuntarily or without thinking put so much out there willingly that somebody that you don't trust or some kind of bad actor could very easily guess at what your password might be, what the answer to your security question might be. So as so much of this information gets digitized and used and shared and handled by so many people and actors and stakeholders, it becomes very, very vulnerable. So this idea of the body containing information that is often used and traded becomes really sensitive, because if you lose a password, you can change it. What happens if fingerprints and irises are compromised and an entire database collecting them is hacked? You can't change your fingerprint. And unlike the movie Minority Report, where Tom Cruise, pulled out his eyeballs and got new ones and then passed himself off as a Japanese man and fooled a lot of systems, ordinary people like you and me can't exactly do that. Maybe in a science fiction universe, not that far away, maybe that would be possible. But right now, for the common man, that's still, a science fiction story. So this idea that we increasingly rely on more and more and more and more pieces of data to validate us and to give us legitimacy and confirm our existence poses a lot of risks. And unfortunately, in trying to untangle these problems, in trying to validate our existence when systems fail or when systems are hacked and breached, it's often the case that the risk is shifted onto the weakest link. So it's often the user, the poorest person in the link, the one who's the most digitally illiterate, who has the horrible task of proving to a very big bank or a government that they really are who they say they are. And if they don't have identification documents, or if their biometrics have been compromised, this becomes absolutely impossible for them to do. So with big data come a lot of big risks as well. And if there's one lesson I would urge you all to take away from this, is just to be mindful of those risks and to do your best to minimize them when you create systems that harness all the wonderful things that big data might be able to do. And one of the things that compounds all of these issues and sort of contributes to the lack of the nuance is that when we talk about things like big data or all kinds of other new technologies, whether it's the Internet of Things, whether it's smart cities, whether it's all kinds of, exercise apps that will track us and that will help us, become more fit, things like Fitbit and all kinds of other belts and bracelets that you can wear, it becomes really clear that the public discourse about these new technologies tends to veer towards two sort of diverging ends of the spectrum. Either they're all cast as progress narratives where, oh my God, these are all shiny and new and wonderful, they're going to change the world and they're going to really empower people. Or it's a complete moral panic saying, oh my God, this is going to kill life as we know it. This is going to mean the internet will never be the same again. This means that, we're going to have to start putting money in a sock under our mattress because all of these systems will fail. Nothing can be trusted. People can't be trusted. Systems can't be trusted. Everything will fail. So don't rely on any of them. So when you have a public discourse, or when you have an ill-informed media or a lazy media, or when people don't really understand the risks and they talk about it in these very stark black and white terms, you end up having one side of the discourse saying everything that big data can do is wonderful and nothing can ever go wrong. Or you have people saying it's nothing but doom and gloom, we should ban it and we should have regulation against it. So somewhere between these two black and white ends of the spectrum, somewhere in the gray area, we need to find a sweet spot where we can maximize all the benefits of data and help it to solve really big societal problems that we couldn't otherwise, while also minimizing the harmful effects. And to be particularly mindful of the harmful effects, not just on society as a whole or for the average person, but particularly for the most disadvantaged people, for the most marginalized, for the outliers. Because if you're an average person, you might not be very harmed by big data. But if you're slightly different, if you're an outlier, you will quickly statistically jump out of the data set. You will be seen as the freak or the potential criminal, even if you're not, just because you might be different. And last time I checked, in our society, being different wasn't a punishable crime. So it's really important that we retain nuance and that we function in this middle ground rather than in these two ends of the spectrum of black and white. And the other reason is you need to have a reality check about what a lot of technologies can do. This is from XKCD, which I think, apart from being one of the funniest and most thoughtful and wise comic books around, or comic strips around, I tweeted the other day that it's clear to me that XKCD has the answers to all of the questions of life, but I also think it also asks all the best questions that we should be asking. And so on the left-hand side, for those of you who can't read it, it's sort of this crypto nerd's imagination, of how technology should function in an ideal world. So one guy is telling the other, his laptop is encrypted. Let's build $1 million cluster to crack it. And the other computer guy says, it's no good, it's 4096-bit RSA. And the guy goes, oh no, blast, our evil plan is foiled. So, in a computer science-enabled universe, this is what you think will happen, that the laptop is encrypted, it has all this wonderful technology on it, so anybody's evil intentions will immediately be stopped. But the right-hand side is what I often see in the developing world, which is what would actually happen, where his laptop is encrypted, but you drug him and you hit him on this head with this $5 wrench until he tells you the password. And that's usually what happens in a lot of systems where you might have an identity scheme, which, people are supposed to put their fingerprints on and check, but you're in a village in the middle of nowhere, in some awful part of, a desert or a farmland where your internet connectivity is really low. And the guy who's supposed to be in charge of giving you your monthly rations on which your family survives, he may just say, you know what, today there's no electricity, or he may say, the machine's not working, I'm not going to switch it on. And he will still get his bribe, even in a system that is meant to not allow that to happen. So this kind of offline misuse will still happen. This sort of, various variations of this drug him and hit him on the head with a hammer or a wrench. That is how often technology gets abused in not just the Western world, but particularly in the emerging world. So when we think of data, when we think of big data, we talked about ownership. And I mentioned in the beginning that maybe ownership is not the best frame, but just to run through a couple of ideas. One is this idea of data as property. And I'm just going to use these as, this is not for lawyers and it's not necessarily for people who've, you're all from different disciplines. So I wanted this to be a very general talk and not just go into legal theories of privacy and data, but give you very few quick quotes and provocations just to get you to think about the different frames and models for how we could think about big data. One is the idea of data as property. This is a quote from Dino Rose at a very well-known law firm called Norton Rose Fulbright. He was quoted in this article, which really is talking about cloud computing, where you're saying when all of the data is held in the cloud, who actually owns it? Because you may have jurisdiction issues, you may have issues of companies and how they have different policies in different countries. You may have ideas around, well, if you're outsourcing part of it and somebody is running the back end and somebody is actually running the interface, somebody wrote the software, ownership is not a very clear-cut thing. So the idea of property when it comes to data actually may not work very well. So he says in this article, under English law, there are no property rights in data as such. But he goes on to clarify that this has not necessarily prevented people from treating it as property. So we find proxies, we find different ways in which data is thought of as some kind of a property right. And he goes on to say that markets exist for buying or selling data, and individuals regularly disclose their personal data in exchange for goods and services. However, his sort of nuanced view is the value in all of these cases is created through the way that the data is bought and sold in particular ways, and the fact that the marketplace actually exists and there's exchange that takes place, rather than a so-called legal right of ownership. So no legislation in the world may provide for a specific property right that specifically deals with data, but there are systems that will provide something approximate to that. There are ways that people will behave as if data is property, and where they will buy and sell. You may sell a database to an advertising company. Somebody may buy the contents of a phone book. The government may sell the contents of a census. So what's also important to remember, which a lot of people don't, is you're selling that particular structured data. You're selling a database, and the value that it may have may be in the way that somebody took completely public and free information, but they arranged it in a way that was meaningful. They added structure to it. They gave it some kind of a framework that made it useful and increased its utility. So the data itself may not be property in that sense, that it could be something that was paid for by government funding, that therefore nobody owns. It could be part of a data commons. It could be in the public domain. But the way in which that data then gets put into a very, very large big data repository may actually create something of bigger value than the individual pieces of data which may not actually have any property rights attached to them. And there are ways that people will buy and sell and trade and arbitrage and exchange these things as if data was a chair or a table and carried with it certain property rights. So that's just one view. Some people do think of data as having property rights attached to it. And you can see why this is a compelling frame, because if I own my data, I have within that the right to control it. If it's my phone, I may have a right against someone who steals it. If I think of it as my house, I may have a right of trespass against somebody who just walks into it without my permission. So there are wonderful notions that attach to the idea of property, and if we could attach them to data, they may help us control data as it flows through different systems, and that might be a very useful frame for looking at how you manage and control data. Of course, this breaks down in particular instances because you sort of reach a dead end very quickly. You try to track who has your data and who is using it, but then Facebook collected it, but who are they sharing it with? You don't know. Who is Google selling your browsing history to? You don't know. Are they selling it? You don't know. Their privacy policy may give you very general information about it, but nothing specifically about your piece of data. And there's no tracking system. It's not like with FedEx or UPS where your package leaves your home and you can track this was picked up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is now in New York State. This is now on its way to Peshawar. You can't track it in quite the same way. So this idea of property may not quite work. What about the other ways? A lot of people collect data even if they don't necessarily want it, even if it is not core to the product or the business that they're trying to do, but it ends up being a business model because it might subsidize the real thing you want to do. So for example, if you created a health device that on its own might cost $100, but if you were able to somehow sell the data that people provided every time they did a blood test on a phone or every time they did some other health-related transaction, if they were able to sell that to insurance companies or sell it to medical companies or pharmaceutical companies, the money that they make would enable them to drive down the cost of the device, which in a developing country is a wonderful result. Being able to have affordable healthcare and affordable devices is a wonderful gain. And maybe you're paying for it with data, but that might be seen as, people will say, well, you don't have any real privacy rights anyway. What kind of horrible life do you have? Wouldn't you rather be well? So your data is sold, but your life is not very private anyway. You sleep on the street, you're a homeless person, you don't have a toilet, you use, all of the universe as a public bathroom. So what kind of privacy do you have that you're trying to protect anyway? But maybe if the data was used and it somehow resulted in cheaper healthcare or cheaper benefits, maybe it's worthwhile. So the idea that data as a business model to subsidize the real goal of a project, maybe that's something that a lot of people do, and maybe it's not something to knock. So in this particular quote, there was this person, Yale Zhang, who founded Safeheart, and it's this eye oximeter which measures oxygen levels. And in this article that Adam Tanner, who used to be at Harvard and might still be, he's a journalist, and he wrote in this article in Forbes about how the cost of a person's data might actually subsidize costs of devices, and how because of this possibility of it being used as a business model, companies will go and collect data even though it's not actually critical. So, for example, if you want to just measure the amount of oxygen in blood, you don't need to know that person's height, gender, weight, age, and all kinds of other things. They may be useful to a doctor for other reasons, but just to measure a particular metric, you might not need that. But when you're using the device, you might end up collecting all of these because that might come in handy when you sell the data to somebody else. So that might drive the creation of big data. What about the other option of it as an investment opportunity? You may not need the data. You might not find it useful at all to what you're trying to do with your product or your service. But one day, if you're going to be acquired, it may have value. Maybe your company, when it wants to do an IPO, maybe the data creates huge value. Maybe someday if a company wants to acquire you, the value of the data of your customers is actually what they really want. They might not actually care about the device. Maybe they want to understand that segment of the market that you service, and therefore the data is more valuable than the device or the tool that you've created. So the data may actually have greater value than the technology itself. So when you think of it as an investment opportunity, a lot of people think of it forward. Many people are forward thinking and collect data that they might not necessarily consider fundamental to their product. So as someone said, Tim Chang of the Mayfield Fund quoted in this great article on who really owns your personal data. He said, well, without the data, it's just a bracelet business, and that's not interesting at all. So, all of these trackers that, monitor how fast you're running and how much, how many calories you're burning, without that data being shared and used by the company and them gaining very rich insights, not just about one person, but about a whole community of people or a whole category of people, it's just jewelry without all of that information. I would like to attribute this, but on the internet it was not entirely clear. So whoever used Photoshop to create this wonderful image, I'm sorry that I don't know your name. So it's a great parody of a $1 bill in the US, which paraphrases the usual text to say, in social media we trust, and that's a picture of Mark Zuckerberg, and it's almost, the usual quote that if you're not paying, you are the product. And this actually gives a piece of you as the dollar bill. And this kind of raises the idea that when we're thinking of things like social media, which might all be free, is this idea of ownership even meaningful? In the way that we remix information, the way that we retweet things, the way that we share, we favorite, we collaboratively create things, we crowdsource things, we generate things from the public sphere. Is this idea of it being a bilateral exchange between two empowered parties, does that even make sense anymore? Which brings me to the question that I asked at the beginning, that when we ask who owns big data, are we even asking the right question? And this was something that Fred Trotter brought out in his piece about who owns patient data. So this is specific to the healthcare sector, but it could apply equally to just about any sector that harnesses big data. He says the question, who owns the data, presumes that the notion of ownership is valid, and it jettisons those foolish enough to try and answer the question in a needlessly circular debate. And he says, I'm not going to read out all of this because we're running out of time, but he says that ownership is a very poor starting point for health data because that kind of a concept doesn't map very well to the people and the organizations and the relationships that they have with data. So he says neither a patient nor a doctor nor the programmer has a strictly ownership relationship with patient data. And he thinks of it in terms of privileges. And he says all of them have a unique set of privileges. And this is actually a really useful frame that a lot of other people have talked about, where you say maybe ownership doesn't quite work, but if you think of it as a set of rights and privileges or licenses, but what can and can't be done. So for example, software. Most of us don't own the software that we use. We use it under license. Because if we were to buy the software from Microsoft, we wouldn't be able to afford it. It would be a gazillion dollars. But because we license it, each of us gets a tiny piece of it and we don't own it. And it's not an exclusive use that I have. All of us might be able to use the same software because the number of people that use it doesn't change the inherent quality or the nature of that good. It is a good that can be multiplied without any degradation or decay to the original. So in the same way that we think of software in terms of licenses rather than ownership, maybe if we think of data also as a set of privileges or rights or entitlements, maybe the doctor has particular privileges in relation to patient data. And there are very controversial questions about whether the patient should have access to exactly what the doctor has. And say, well, why is he not entitled? If the doctor makes notes on his medical file, does the patient also not have a right to know what that is? And there are doctors who push back on this and say no, because I've had many years of medical training. I've gone to medical school and I have the experience to write a few things that the patient who is uneducated or the patient who is not a medical specialist may not understand. And there's a bigger risk that if doctors had to make all of this information available, they would be so scared of lawsuits, they would be so scared of this being transparent to people that they may never write anything, which means that the next time the patient came to them, a critical piece of information where the doctor may have said he looked upset or he looked depressed when he came in to see me, he may never write that on the file, but it may dictate future treatment for the person that is then lost in the doctor's memory because they can't remember everything. So it may be the privileges that a doctor has in relation to the data necessarily should be different from the privileges that the user has, and it certainly should be different from the privileges that the technology provider has. Maybe it should be anonymized, it should be de-identified, it should be protected and secure in ways that nobody can actually access it, including the person creating the technology. So if we look at it as different rights and privileges that attach to the same piece of data, rather than the idea of ownership and property, maybe that's a better way of looking at this. I'm going to skip the next couple of slides because they're not really relevant, but it was just about a project that I worked on with a bunch of people where we were so conscious that data and technology are so frequently used by people who don't understand all of these things that I've been talking about. So we co-wrote this book, but 12 of us wrote this in a little farmhouse outside of Amsterdam a year ago, where the joke about the title was somebody said, can data ever be kept secure? Can big data ever be truly managed and controlled? And one of the people who runs a software company and a hosting company said, well, yeah, theoretically you can. You can shoot it into space. You can shoot your hard drive with all of the data into space and then nobody can ever touch it. It can never be hacked. Nobody can ever see it. Of course, it's also completely useless, but you can keep it entirely secure. And that again picks up the point I made about how you have to have a sliding scale between utility and absolute secrecy and privacy, and where you put that, where you run the sliding scale and what you optimize for is a question that you really need to think about, saying, for this particular use or for this particular system or for solving this particular problem, do I care more about how secure it is? Do I care more about how open it is? Do I care more about the utility of this? And those are very specific, nuanced decisions that should be made closer to the time and in the local context, and there's no one size fits all. So we wrote this little guidebook for people in the development sector, particularly who are, they mean very well, they're well-intentioned, but they're trained as anthropologists or development economists or, specialists in water delivery or solar power. They're not necessarily cryptographers or lawyers. So they're not thinking about data in the ways that somebody like me or a computer scientist here in the Science Center might think about it. So we said, well, you could shoot your hard drive into space, but there have got to be better ways that are useful and possible and realistic. So we titled it Shooting Your Hard Drive into Space and Other Ways to Practice Responsible Development Data. I didn't include a link to it in this, but if anybody is interested, feel free to email us at Harvard and I can share this with you. It's a public document that you're all free to use. But the opening slide for this, and one of the provocations that we had, was we kept coming up against people in the development world who said, I'm not a data scientist, or my job is not to look at data. There's an IT department that looks at it. I don't deal with data. And so we created this tongue-in-cheek slide where we sort of did a little flowchart saying, am I working with data? And this is kind of small for you to read maybe, but it basically says, yes, you are. Almost certainly. Everybody works with data, even if it's not the fundamental or core aspect of their job. So do you rely on information for work? Yes. So it takes you straight to, congratulations, you work with data. But if you were to even go further down and you say, no, I don't rely on information for work, it says, do you use a computer in your work? No. Well, have you ever read anything for your work? Yes. No. And it sort of takes you down this tree where even if you keep saying no, 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 you come up to a sort of jokey block that says, I don't believe you. And so basically the idea was this slide was, even if you don't understand it, you are working with data. It may not be data in a spreadsheet. It may not be data uploaded to a computer. But every time you interact with people, every time you talk to them, every time you get information, every time you make a note of something, every time you listen to someone's story, every time you engage with a villager or a farmer and ask him what his problems are, you're collecting data. Anytime you're providing a report to your funder, you're dealing with data and analyzing it. Every time you create a file like the first guy in the picture from Jan Banning's wonderful photograph, you're storing, processing, analyzing, sharing, and dealing with data. So we really wanted to highlight that even if you think you're not working with data, chances are that you are. I'm going to skip over some of these, but I wanted to show you very briefly before I end 2 very quick projects that I find that rather than a lot of academic articles that talk about big data and all the horrible things that it can do or all the wonderful things that it can do, I find responses from the arts are a lot more compelling and powerful, and they really sort of problematize and highlight these things in a very visual and a very visceral way for people. So one of my favorite projects was by a woman called Jennifer Lynn Morone, who took this idea that we're all collections of data. We are all made up of pieces of information, and those pieces of information get to define who we are. It's the pieces of data in a system that might actually create my virtual identity or who I am. It may or may not represent me. It could be completely accurate in a creepy way. It could be completely wrong. But this idea that the data embodies us and we embody data. So she took this to its completely logical extreme, partly as a political comment and partly as an artistic endeavor, and she incorporated herself. So the JLM Inc. is an actual company where she took the view that, well, if you actually want to make money off of my information, this is what it cost me to become me. So she says, this is what my education cost. This is what I inherited from my father. This is what living and working in Germany cost me. This is what living and working in France cost me. This is what, I earned. So she basically quantifies everything that went towards, these are all the raw materials and inputs that made her the person that she is today. And she says, well, fine, everybody's making money off of data. I'm going to incorporate myself and take control of it, and I'm going to be the one that decides how much people get to pay to use my data. So she's created a project which she calls DOME, which stands for Database of Me, which I think is a wonderfully reflexive and thoughtful way of highlighting how data becomes us and we become data, and how ownership, as we started to talk about, may take very strange forms. So she actually decided that she would create a database of me and she would be the one who manages that. So a lot of people talk about data colonialism and how data is the new kind of wave of ruling people and making decisions about them. So kind of feeding off of that idea of data empires, she comes up with this idea of bye-bye data slavery. So she no longer wants to be a slave to another system. She wants to take control of it by incorporating herself. So this is one very interesting and extreme approach that somebody has taken to managing the sort of harmful effects of big data. And this is a very long quote, but I will leave you with this, where when interviewed, somebody said, well, do you think people gain or lose from this extension of capitalism to their own person? It seems a little perverse. And what she says is, yes, what I'm doing is outside the realm of ordinary behavior. So she admits that this is not the most normal, average response. But she says we're made to believe in what I consider a very perverse economic system. So she says, yes, this is an extreme reaction, but it's prompted by a very extreme system. And it's the kind of economic system we have that quantifies data and that makes decisions based on it, that it's not what I expected after millennia of evolution. She's like, this is not where I thought we would be. And she says, well, here we are. It's obvious that capitalism works best for capitalists. So I'm experimenting with myself as the subject, which is actually wonderful in itself, because most people experiment with big data on other people, usually other people who have no option but to say yes, or who are never asked at all if they want their data collected. So she's using it as a way to push things to the extreme, to provoke change and to actually reflect where things are. And she says systems and governments have been adjusted and overthrown before. The problem with this one is that it works too well for the ones running it, but not well enough for the rest. And the disparity is growing wider. And I think that last sentence is very central to like all of the previous slides that I've talked about, where it's the disparity that actually affects our experience of data. And the problem is that it works very well for the people who own and control the data and who make the decisions of how it should be used. And it doesn't really work that well for the people who are data subjects or who are unwilling or willing participants in the system without understanding what a matrix it is. The other project, so her idea is we just lock everything down and like I will manage and control it. That's one response. The other response, which was very interesting, was by a wonderful professor, artist, media theorist and conceptual artist called Hassan Elahi, who for various reasons in the sort of fear-mongering and threat models after 9/11 was deemed as suspicious by his neighbors because, he, like me, in fact, like the life of most academics and scholars that I know, he was traveling all over to do exhibitions, to give talks, to give lectures. He had a very irregular life, which sort of showed a suspicious pattern. And, having a Muslim name did not help. So very long story short, without going into the details of how this happened, he arrived in the US after one of his trips and was detained at the airport for investigation. They interrogated him, and it was a very, very long and horrible ordeal for him. And it took something like almost 200 interviews with law enforcement before they realized, okay, he's just a guy who travels a lot and he's not actually a terrorist. But under that period that he was under investigation, they needed to be aware of his whereabouts at all times. They needed to be able to track him. So his wonderful, very, very clever response to this was also born out of a skepticism, saying, you had a lot of information even about things like 9/11 and you didn't exactly stop it. Having data doesn't necessarily stop bad things happening. So he said, the more data you collect, the more nonsense you have. And the more junk you have to deal with. So you're looking for the needle in the haystack. But if you keep making the haystack bigger and bigger and bigger, you will never find that needle. You will never find meaning through that huge haystack of data. So he created this wonderful website called Tracking Transients, which was his take on, this is all so transient. What are you actually trying to hold on to or grasp or find meaning in? So he at all times showed his location. He showed his exact point on a map. The house that he was staying in or the hotel that he was in, the room that he was in, you can see the little red arrow pointing to where that house is. So he kept providing levels of data every day, 24 hours, 7 days of the week, 365 days of the year. He took a picture of every bathroom that he used before he used it, saying, okay, this is where I am right now. He took a picture of every meal and the time that he ate it. He took pictures of what it was. And this was his idea of saying, yes, you can collect a lot of data, but it could be completely meaningless. What are you going to do with all these pictures? You know where I am, but does it tell you anything useful about me? Not really. So it was a wonderful meditation on the fact that a lot of data can be great, but it can also make your job of finding useful information completely impossible, or at least very, very difficult. So these are two kind of extreme examples. Either you make the haystack very big, as Hassan Ilahi did, or you make the needle very, very difficult to find, or you control the needle, as Jennifer Lynn Morone did. So I just present these to you as two ways that people have challenged the ubiquity and in what they see as the overreach of big data. So I just thought those were two very fun projects to share with you. So to end, what do we do next? What are the next steps? I like to think that one of the first things we do is we don't think of people as data subjects or objects. Subjects is still a better term than objects, but often people are just numbers. They're just quantified into data points to, somewhere along a map or a trajectory or a grid, not as people. So if we actually think of them as subjects and people with rights and entitlements, that's a wonderful way forward. A lot of people find even the term data subjects very problematic, but it implies you're subjected to somebody else's will, and it's a very colonial framing of the world. But I think a lot of lawyers don't find it problematic because a lot of very, very empowering and enabling legislation around the world uses this term data subject as a very defined, specifically limiting term. So data subject, as used in a lot of legislation, actually gives that person rights. So I leave you with both data subjects and objects, and you can choose how you feel about them. But I think one thing that's very, very critical is how you align incentives. How do you work such that the good and the bad can be balanced? How do you find the right incentives so that good data is used in beneficial ways to solve social problems, and you disincentivize bad behavior, or you disincentivize abuse? So this is something that's a cross-disciplinary problem. It's something that technology, academia, sociologists, government, policymakers, users, all of whom need to be involved in this conversation about how you align these incentives to maximize good outcomes. You need to close the loop. You need to not have extractive use of big data where data subjects or objects are just there at the end of a chain and the data is being gathered about them, but the results or the analysis is never actually shared with them. Maybe if you said, oh, we did all this analysis in your village and it became clear that your, crime rates could go down if you had traffic lights at these places, or you could cut down on, potholes if everybody reported it to the government, or roads could be paved better. And if you actually shared it with the community and you shared the data and the findings that you did, maybe the community would find really interesting, creative ways of actually using that data for their own benefit, because they understand their own situation much better than some outside person can. And while the outside perspective might be very, very useful, it may show them things they'd never thought of. It needs to be a partnership so that you benefit from the distant view as well as the close granularity that they can bring. So closing the loop, having good feedback loops is really important. Exploring alternatives. Is big data the only way you can solve something? Is there a better way of doing it without collecting very sensitive information? Maybe we should do that. Maybe there's a privacy-preserving alternative. Maybe there's a more secure offline alternative. Maybe you don't collect certain types of data at all. So looking at alternatives is a really key thing before you go and spend money on technology. Articulating the harms is really useful. Educating media, educating policymakers, and getting better at describing what can go wrong so that people understand what they're dealing with currently. It's kind of like someone famously said, there aren't enough dead bodies in privacy. When it's a genocide, you see harm, people are dying. When data is leaked, people are like, okay, I don't really understand how that affects my life. Or, okay, so the government knows what movie I watched yesterday because they know I use Netflix. So what? How does that harm me in any way? So I think lawyers particularly are really bad at articulating what can go wrong and the harms. And as a community, we should be doing a lot better at this. And to move beyond zero-sum games and binaries, like I mentioned before, and baking and hardwiring a lot of these ethical choices into the design of systems, not thinking of them after you've rolled out the system and then saying, oh God, we didn't think of this, like now let's add it. because often it's really hard to do that. If you actually make it part of the design process and you actually think about these issues, you might have a system that works really well. And you need to embed ethics into all of this, and to have a system of querying this and having, as you have due process in a lot of legal systems when it comes to other civil liberties and rights. Kate Crawford and other academics here at MIT and elsewhere have talked about the need for a big data due process, and there's a wonderful article that they've written about this that I can share. And finally, to think of two things. One, when we keep saying, what does data do for us and how can data solve our problems? Who is the us? Is the us the company or the government that's collecting the data? Or is it really the end user in the community who it's supposed to be for? Who is actually benefiting from all of this number crunching and data? Does it actually reflect on lower prices, better health systems, better education for the end user? That's a really critical question. And the last one is about, if we think of privacy as a very personal value and a selfish value, and you're always comparing it to the great societal gains you can get from big data, you're actually ignoring the fact that there is a notion of societal or collective privacy where when you safeguard privacy, anonymity, free speech, and a lot of other fundamental rights in a democracy or in any kind of government, all of society benefits. So it's not just an individual selfish desire. So I will just leave you with that, and I hope that this has been helpful. These are some of the attributions and links if you would like to understand more about the photography series, about Jennifer Lynn Moron's project, about Hassan Ilahi's website, and my colleague Sarah Watson's article. And a couple of the other things that I haven't linked, I'd be happy to provide. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that presentation. I think so.
I went a little over.
No problem.
A lot over.
I think we'll still have a few minutes if there's any questions. I think we can go to the college in Peshawar if anyone there has questions. Does anyone have questions at that college?
Thank you, ma'am.
Do you have a question?
No, thanks.
Oh, okay. So I think that's it.
Great.
The next webinar will be on November 17th, and it's about mobile health at the Nasik Kumbh Mela. And please go to our website. We'll post some of these articles that has been mentioned throughout the presentation on our website for resources. And please continue the conversation on Twitter. I know Malavika is very active, so please reach out to her if you have questions. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for listening in. Bye.